Hello, thank you, Stefan. For those of you who haven't received or don't have in your hands the program, which I call to your attention, that was Stefan Zeniuk, and the names of his numerous musicians who played the composition which he wrote for Richard are listed. I won't try to read them, thank you. We have Jim Toth here, who's mainly moving music stands around. He's supremely overcompensated for. My name is Alana Heiss, for those of you who are under 50 and don't know that you are at PS1, where a lot of this action began, and which I was the founding director. And in '76 was an opening of the Rooms show, the opening of the building. And a number of the artists that we love and honor, Richard, the primary tonight person that we speak about, worked in '76 to make Rooms the most beautiful environmental show that had ever been about installation, which they were all deeply concerned with. And I'm sorry that we're missing some of the artists who are alive and kicking, who couldn't be here and planned on coming, like Bob Grosvenor and Jackie Windsor, who had a variety of physical incidents which prevented them from coming, mainly happening in bars or dances. They're all still very lively. But the rest of you who are here, many of you were in that show, and I thank you for coming. And I thank all of you for coming tonight to honor our great friend and that great artist, Richard Nonas. His death last year, May 11th, 2021, was actually not a tragedy at all when you really stop and think about it. When I was 17 years old, my best friend, Mary Beth Chambers, was going to a road show to hear Chuck Berry play down in St. Louis, and a bunch of other teenagers. And when I got up in the morning, I found they'd all been flattened in one of those Midwestern train accidents where a whole car of teenagers disappear like pancakes under the train. Mary Beth was 17, and she'd done nothing more but be a cheerleader and have a couple of good boyfriends. In her life, nothing happened ever. Richard lived till, how old, Jan? 85. He worked up until the day that he died. He was making work. In the last decade or so of his life, he had not only a great dealer who actually helped organize tonight's events, Fergus McCaffrey, with Allyson, Spellacy, his director, who's worked day and night on this. Fergus, of course, is working day and night, too. In any case, Richard had made great work, had shows all over the world, had a good gallery, and had a good relationship. In fact, the only one that he'd probably maintained for over 2 or 3 years in his whole life. And he was happy with Jan, and Stefan was his stepson. Richard never cared much for kids, but at the end of his life, he became enormously fond of Stefan and really liked to be with him, was enormously proud of his music. So I'm glad that Stefan wrote something for us. But we're going to talk about sort of the beginning. The program, such as it is, mainly focuses on performances by two people who were very, very friendly and a big part of Richard's life, Laurie Anderson, and Dickie Landry, who came up from Louisiana to be with us and play. But a few of us are going to say some words, and they're on your program also. I'm going to read you something, if it doesn't disappear off my iPad, that talks about the very, very beginning of Richard in New York. It's excerpts from an unpublished memoir by an ex-girlfriend named Carol Gooden, who not only was with Richard, but then was with Gordon Matta, started food restaurant and a bunch of other things. And she's recording her entrance into New York and meeting Richard. I thought you might enjoy this. Richard Nonas was a minimalist. He felt he could portray the beauty he had seen as an anthropologist while living with the Athabascan Indians in the Hudson Bay region and the Papago Indians of Arizona and Mexico far better through sculpture than through a doctoral thesis. Richard had a wiry body, a bushy black beard, Sephardic eyes from his Russian Jewish heritage, and body movements that looked like a Mexican jumping bean in action when he laughed. He made his own severely simple leather jackets and pounded buttons out of dimes. He stripped every recognizable part off his bicycle to make it just the minimal wheels, chain, and handlebar. Richard was probably, 25 when she's writing about him now, and she was younger, as she points out in another part of her memoirs. He read incessantly and listened to good music. He had the best in early recorded folk music. After days of reading, he would get up and make 3 or 4 or 5 sculptures, sticks which lay on the floor in a row, blocks of wood arranged in a form that had meaning to him, flat pieces of iron, all the same, perhaps in a circle. Now, I'm going to read just a little bit of the next paragraph because it gets a little funny. When we met at the drawing class, Richard pursued me. I told him I did not want to have any relationships, that I was going to college at night and was very serious about it. It seemed to be his goal to convince me of the uselessness of college. We had many an hour of debate about it. What was I going to do with my life? And so on. Richard was such a busybody that he interfered with all of our lives, told us all what to do and why we should do it, and very rationally presented us all of the options. In my case, he was my best friend, and he absolutely advised me on every show that I ever did. I would talk to him about the installation, not only all the shows at PS1, but all the shows before PS1 at the Clock Tower. Every space I ever had, Richard did a show in, and he'd come in and we'd do it. But also when I did other shows, he would talk through the logic of the show, and when the installation was going on, he would come and critique it. I had a number of artists who helped me in this way. One was Alex Katz. He and Richard hated each other, and I would have them come to advise me on different days, because if they saw each other, it was a very unpleasant situation. And he would always say, "What did Katz say about this?" And Katz would always say, "I suppose Nonas told you to throw that out," and so on and so on. But really, up until the very end, Richard and I had these discussions. He always wanted me to leave PS1 long before I did. He said I should go and do something else. He encouraged me to go into the movie business, blah, 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 blah. But many people in this room sit here, and what I say is familiar to you because he probably was on the phone to you telling you that you should do this or shouldn't do that. Carol writes about this very articulately. She talks about how she saw Gordon at one of the openings, and Gordon seemed a little easier to be with than Richard, which is, of course, true. Gordon was a very nice guy, and not as demanding as Richard. But she also talks about their divorce, which Richard referred to as when we stopped living together, because, as he said, we're not getting divorced, we're stopping living together. He was very rational. And the way they managed their divorce is a famous, famous Soho artist story. They had a loft on Wooster Street. I guess it was a Green Street, I can't remember. And they flipped a coin. Richard had found the loft, but as Carol points out, it was her money that bought it. So they said, let's flip a coin. The winner gets the loft, the loser gets the dog. The dog's name is Glauza, a very famous dog. He was in a lot of dances. I don't know if he danced with Joan, but he danced with Trish, he danced with lots. And he also wrote a number of books, which were primarily written by Richard. His most famous one was called My Life on the Floor by Glauza. Glauza was enormous. He was a mountain dog and a St. Bernard and a whole bunch of things, a mutt. And Carol got the dog. She cried. She said, Richard, let's flip again. He said, okay. They flipped again. And, he got the loft again. So Gordon said to Carol, don't cry, Carol. I have a loft, but we don't have a dog. So that was the happy, not living together story of Carol and Richard. We're going to go now to Molly Nesbit, who is a writer that Richard respected enormously, and I was sitting in on many of their discussions, and I'm glad that she's going to talk a bit about his art and not about his life in the early days.
Yeah, I come from college, I'm sorry to say, but I met Richard in 2008, so I come late from college. I teach college, went to college. I'm a classically trained art historian who's not so classical, and I met Richard because I wanted to talk about the big world in which he lived, which included art, his art, and the art of many of you. And the thing I'd like to say first is that it's not easy to speak about his art because he wanted to take it all away from words. And so I'm here tonight to say, look, Richard did not like to be boxed in by words. This puts me in an awkward situation. And I have only the time of a hard-boiled egg. But I also talked to him a fair bit, intermittently, but a fair bit, and our conversations went wide, and I, being from college, took notes. And the thing that he said right away, and I'm going to use his words to get out of the box that we don't want to be in, was that Richard was hard-headed, but he was true. And when you were in conversation with him, he liked words, but he wanted to communicate ideas without them. That's a quote. He told me that right away. But we went on because he nonetheless liked ideas. He liked the ones the spirits are talking. He liked the ones that language could release into the actual world. Release, but not passively. And he liked to talk about energy. He talked about the energy implicit in contradiction. He wasn't interested in talking about contradiction itself or definitions of contradiction. He wanted to talk about the gap between seeing and saying, and how it becomes, he was speaking in English, but he's really speaking in French. It becomes a literal doubleness, he said. The gap between seeing and saying becomes a literal doubleness, unable to be separated, but joined. And this is the key thing, moving. And then he lit into a metaphor, saying, the way he did, he just rushed into the next idea. Art deals with how to deal with the world by creating centaurs. And then I remember he was so pleased with himself. Combination animals, he said. And I thought, wow, and I wrote it all down. But mainly we confined ourselves to talking on the oblique and talking about the ways he lived and worked. We talked about the way always that he worked with other people. And he introduced me to a fair number of them, for which I am grateful. He also talked about the way his work was meant to sit in the world and basically create a kind of problem, to work with and against the current, to check and divert automatic passage. It made you stop, in other words, and it made you step in a way that you had to be conscious, right, of the step, of your place in the run of life. And, when I see his work, I think always, not too formally, about the run of life that moves through it and around it. But also in the run of life with Richard, you're never completely there by yourself. And that was a big point. I suppose it's a way of aspiring to be centaurs. Now, in January of 2021, so in that last winter of Richard's, we had a big Zoom. And we picked up our old topics. We'd found the Zoom. We'd been talking intermittently with Alana in the same room. But in January 2021, of course, we were in mid-pandemic. And he was quite eloquent about the state of things then. And I thought it would be a good thing to use Richard's late words. "It's been a strange time for me," he said. "I must say, in a way, I've really enjoyed it. I think I mentioned to you, I felt and I thought of myself as being on a small sailboat sailing across the Atlantic alone. And I had to pay attention to everything because it was all it was, everything was trying to kill me. But I had to do it all myself." He's thinking on the fly, but I think that's important to keep that. I didn't edit anything out. But I had to do it all myself, and I was alone, and I was restricted, and in a certain sense, every day was like every other day, except it was totally different, because you never know what's going to happen. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I got a lot of work done. I got a lot of thinking done, most of which I forgot. But that's okay. I remember parts of it from time to time. And it was a very extraordinary thing. And then, and then this thing in the Capitol, and he's talking about the insurrection. This thing in the Capitol, I suddenly remembered in 1968, I was living in Paris. And I was in a lot of things that felt very desperate on the streets of Paris of that time. But it was 50 years ago, being pushed by the police through a gap of two cars that were being pushed together, and everybody terrified that that they wouldn't get through the stop, that kind of thing. So it's been I don't know whether you've had that experience, but I've always been fascinated with different ways. Not, I was going to say different ways of thinking, but I didn't mean different ways. I mean different spaces. Different spaces to think in my own head. That is, in the space of terror, in the space of, something had to be done, in the space of something where you, in a certain sense, and then wanted to stop thinking about it, but can't stop thinking about all kinds of things like that. And for me, those things I've always had, I think, my way of conceptualizing anything is spatial. So they're really literally places, spaces, rooms, different kinds of rooms. And I think that's what I think about art, too. Or in making it, but all those things that came together in this period of time, tumbling one over the other. And in that tumbling, tripping over each other, including yesterday, and yesterday was, in a way, that was the moment of clearing. Suddenly, that was the last step. It felt like there was an open space ahead in the world, but also inside my head.
So Molly's taller than I am. Everybody is taller than I am. And the next person coming up here is taller than I am, too. We thank not only the wonderful folks here at PS1 and the team that Ruba has assembled that helped us do this, and of course, as usual, the beautiful poster which Fergus and Allyson made. But again, it's important to recognize that Richard was a primary agent of a group of artists who really built all the alternative ways of showing art in New York for the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And Aggie Gund, who's familiar to most all of us, is a friend, a collector, and a terrific friend to artists. So she has assumed the mantle of trying to talk a little bit about what the visions of those artists, many of whom are here right now, meant to that time of showing art when the museums weren't so interested. Aggie's been involved with both the museum world, as we know, primarily MoMA, and the non-museum world here at PS1. And she's just going to say a little bit tonight about Richard and her involvement with that world and what it meant to her.
Thank you, Alana. Thank you very much. You can hear me? Good evening. As you know, I'm Agnes Gunn. To most of you here tonight as Aggie, I'm proud to be standing here at PS1, a place which I've loved since I first moved to New York in 1981. Alana and I met at Monicotti's restaurant down the street, and she asked me to join the board. My association with PS1 has been a constant feature of my life in New York and my life with artists as friends. One of these friends was Richard Nonas, both as a board member of PS1 and a lover of sculpture. I had been happy to know Richard Nonas for over 40 years. Thank you all for joining us today in a celebration of this remarkable man. Some have said that I named one of my dogs Giotto, a character who made repeated appearances throughout Richard's books and poems. That is not true, but if I get another dog, I did have one named Giotto, perhaps I will name it Glossa for Richard's long-lost dog, a huge animal to whom he dedicated a book, My Life on the Floor, by his wife, Gloria Nonas. I do have a dog now named Bronzino, who everyone asks me all the time, why did you name a dog after a fish? Obviously, I didn't name him after a fish, but an artist. But in the 70s, many artists of that generation decided to put their energy, their visions, and their dreams behind alternative space instead of institutions. I've always been torn by these two exhibition possibilities. The museum I've called home for the last number of years has, of course, been MoMA, but I have enjoyed and loved and respected all the many art spaces that grew up from the efforts of Richard Nonas, Lawrence Weiner, Tina Gerard, Robert Grosvenor, Alan Serrett, Richard Archwater, Robert Uceda, Judith Murray, Marcia Halof, and Laurie Anderson. And far, far too many for me to name. The art community we know today has come out of and grown from their efforts to build the right spaces to support the art of our time. For me, the final choice will always rest with the artists, and I stand behind this with my past, my present, and my future. Richard Nonas was, for PS1, perhaps the most important of the artists who dedicated significant portions of his life to working with Alana and other curators to organize not only his exhibitions, but those of other artists around the world. The result of these efforts have meant that PS1 history reflects a great and glorious record of contemporary artists of the time, of my time and our time. We will always be grateful to Richard for that legacy, and we will miss him dearly. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Aggie. I thought I wouldn't cry, but I might. And now we're turning this over to the pros. Laurie.
Thanks, Alana. I met Richard around 1972, and I just began to hang out more and more often at his place until I was more or less living there. And this went on for a couple of years. Just sort of sitting around in the morning, drinking this triple boiled coffee and looking at wood and talking about how we saw the world and about books and adventure and what language was. And Richard's eyes were always focused in a way that was like 100% looking right at you. And when he turned away, he was immediately in another universe. Now, I was just sort of starting out as an artist, and I suddenly thought, and suddenly through Richard, I was part of a kind of a commune. And there was Richard, there was Phil, there was Trisha, and Jean, and Tina, and Susie, and Dickie, and of course Gordon. And we all had this real sense of purpose. And it didn't matter what we were doing, cooking at food or putting up someone's painting show or sitting around tables talking, like just endlessly talking and talking. And we had this sense that we were going to change the world. And somehow we were going to do this using the energy of this group. Now, I don't think any of us really thought that we were ever going to make a living doing this kind of thing. And we were very proud of having no real plans. I mean, we really felt sorry for people who had plans, actually. Now, Richard was a ringleader of these meetings, and he was always seeing these absolute absurd side of these projects, as well as their dead seriousness. Now, in those 2 years, he told me a lot about what it means to be an artist, and I learned so much from him, and it was extremely irritating as well. Whenever I would start to complain about things, mostly about things like paying the rent, he would always say exactly the same thing. He said, just do your work, and everything else will just kind of happen. And I say, Richard, you don't understand, that this is just not practical, I mean, I have to pay the rent, and I have to, get food and all of this, and it was just like, this is not like a magic world. And he just kept saying, no, just do your work. And it took me years, really, to see what he was saying. It was basically, use your first energy, and that's your best energy. And if you put that energy into paying your rent, you'll definitely be able to pay it. But you might forget why you wanted to pay it in the first place. And he taught me how to live in this magic world. Now, Richard lived in this world for real, and all of the ideas and theories about space and emptiness and all the old stories and language, we're all sort of like tangled up with nature and scrubland and Canada and Mexico, and a lot of what I thought of as this kind of mythical north. And we were very far from nature in Soho, but people, they were all driving pickup trucks, and somehow the connection to nature was very, very central. Now, I wrote some songs for Richard, and I also did music for his kind of epic poem called Lost in Spoleto, which has like a dozen verses. I'm not going to sing all of them, just going to sing a couple of these things today. And I put these into a jukebox over at Holly Solomon's gallery, and Richard really liked them, so I'm just going to play a little excerpt of Lost in Spoleto. It's January 1976, and I'm lost in Spoleto. I'm looking for Giotto because he knows San Francisco, and I'm looking for San Francisco because he knows Mexico. Now Giotto sails summer of 1243. His sheep are forgotten, his brushes are forgotten. The circle is the circle of the sun. Giotto sails and sits, his voice stretched out, background to foreground, his hat pulled over his eyes. And sitting, he plays his fiddle. And the name of the tune is The Man in the Empty Space. The man in the empty space. And the winds change, and the tides change. And Giotto's in Mexico with me, and I'm riding with him. And Giotto rides straight as a scar, straight as the knife that cuts the scar. He says, think of the ways, never the line that gets you there. And as Giotto rides, he points. He points to a cactus, he points to a fox, he points to a stone, he tells a story, and he whistles. It is the man in the empty space. It's the man in the empty space. And there's a fiesta. Giotto's playing the guitar and San Francisco's dancing, and he gives me a drink, special tequila, the kind with the worm in the bottle, alive and swimming. We watch it. Giotto has written a book, and it's a list of the names of the Duke of Spoleto. And the names are Neutral, or the Shield, Man Who Combs, On the Watch, Bitter Body, Hanging Up Rattles, Level-Headed, Grayed Forehead, Falling Day, Hair Burned Off, Open Door. I meet Giotto in a bar celebrating. He says, it's been a long time, Richard. He says, it's been a long time, Richard. And he sings the song, it's called Man in the Empty Space. It's called The Man in the Empty Space. San Francisco is standing by the oak tree. His clothes are old, his hat is old, there's a hole in the knee of his pants, and his elbow comes through his shirt like a stick with a piece of meat on it. And he waits for his coffee to boil, and he does a little dance. He stops, whistles a little tune. The tune is The Man in the empty space. The man in the empty space. And this is the story. She gave him a fish. This is the story. She gave him a fish. That's the story. She gave him a fish. And this is the drawing. And this is the drawing. And this is the drawing. Believe it or not, that's the short version of Lost in Spoleto. I also wrote another song. And it was only one note. And it was a kind of a love song. And it was about a time I stayed at Richard's loft when he was in California. And the loft was just like full of photographs of different places in Sweden. And there was the same woman in all of the photographs, and she's standing there and smiling. Now, most people would have figured this out long before I did. There were also lots of other letters like laying around, and I have to say I did read a couple of those letters. And anyway, the part of the song begins with, well, I thought you two were just friends, till I found a letter. It said, darling, I love you, but you love me better. And I thought, well, what a wonderful love letter. That is so original. You know, I love you, but you love me even better than I love you. And this idea made me really like this person a lot. You know, and that she could see love in such an enlightened way, that she could see how mysterious love is, and the way it's so easy to lose track of who's loving who in what way. Anyway, in the song, I had a dream that I fell in love with her, and that she and I were lovers. And in the song, it says, when we made love all day, underneath your covers, we used all your tools to drill holes in your sculptures. And then we lay on them all night. Now I'm so glad I know her, and I'm so glad I met her. Darling, I love you, but you love me better. Now, when Richard and I broke up, I went to Canada. You know, I hitchhiked to the North Pole, the magnetic pole, not the geographic pole, and it took 3 months. I didn't make it all the way there, but I have Richard to thank for seeing the Northern Lights. And now I'm just going to play a very, very short song for you, Richard. I'd like to invite Dickie to come and play. Dickie Landry.
As you start to assemble your belongings and begin to have drinks, you should hear Richard's voice doing a piece that he made when? 1982. Okay, it's called Goat's Itch. So if you hear this voice, you'll know what it is and who it is. His spirit is with us, everyone. Let's go have a drink.
I'm a goat. I'm a goat in a small village. 50 people, 100 cows, some goats. I'm one. I'm one. One goat. Goats climb. I climb. Tin mountains, chrome foothills, tire to fender, fender to hood, hood to roof. Up, up, I jump up. It's fender first. It's hood second. I tighten my muscles. I release them. It's hood second. I see houses and cows. I see walls and flat cow sides. I jump. It's roof third. It's roof last. It's the top. And that's just the beginning. That's just the start. The place to move up from. Up. Up is my off. Up is my out. I'm working it. I'm jumping it. I'm rubbing my horns on new air. I'm going for it. I'm springing for it. I'm scratching it. I'm inching it up. I itch for it. Goats itch. I'm one. I rise for it. Inexorably toward the top. Pick up or van. Inexorably from the top. 4 feet firm. Body quivering. Nose high. I'm ready to jump. I jump. From the top. Off the top. Reaching for stairs that aren't there. Groping for rungs I never